The Cursed Cemetery of Siberia, a Russian horror story. The Spirits of Krasnoyarsk. It was late September in Krasnoyarsk, Siberia. The kind of autumn where the birch trees turn gold overnight and the temperature drops 10 degrees without warning. The sky was the color of old iron, and the first hints of the coming winter were already creeping into the air. Dmitri had planned everything. He and his two closest friends, Pavel and Alexei, had been talking about a road trip through the Siberian countryside for over a year. Finally, with a long weekend ahead of them, they strapped their bags to their motorcycles and rode out of the city with the wind at their backs, and not a single serious thought between them. Dmitri was the kind of person who believed in nothing he couldn't see or touch. No God, no devil, no spirits. The world was exactly what it appeared to be, and stories of the supernatural were just that, stories. Fairy tales told by superstitious grandmothers in dark kitchens. This trip was going to change all of that. On the second day of the trip, after a long afternoon of exploring the countryside, the three friends found themselves on a narrow road, about 3 kilometers outside the village of Ovsyanka, with the sun still an hour from setting. Pavel spotted it first, a heavy iron gate, old and rusted, half hidden behind overgrown brush at the side of the road. Beyond it, barely visible through the tall weeds, were rows of crumbling stone markers. A cemetery, not just any cemetery. According to Pavel, who had done some reading about the region, this was one of the oldest burial grounds in the area, established during the Tsarist era when Siberia was used as a place of exile. Hundreds of prisoners, exiles, and forgotten people had been buried here. And decades ago, a catastrophic landslide had swept through this section of the valley, killing nearly 150 people in a single night. Many of them had never been properly identified or buried. Their souls, according to local legends, still wandered the grounds. The village of Ovsyanka had considered this place cursed for generations. Dmitri laughed out loud when Pavel finished. "Even better," he said, already climbing off his motorcycle. The three of them pushed through the iron gate and walked into the cemetery without hesitation. The ground was uneven and soft, the old grave markers leaning at odd angles, some so weathered that the names carved into them had been completely erased by time and frost. Pavel had barely finished recounting the history of the place before Dmitri and Alexei were already racing ahead, touching the headstones, kicking at the overgrown grass, speaking too loudly in a place that demanded silence. They took photographs. They posed beside the oldest markers, grinning. They made jokes about the dead. They spent nearly half an hour inside before deciding to head back to their hotel in the village. They started their motorcycles and pulled onto the road, laughing and calling to each other over the engine noise. They had driven barely 1 kilometer when it began. It started as exhaustion, sudden and total, as though someone had reached inside each of them and drained away their energy in a single pull. Then came the pain. Not in one place but everywhere. Deep in the muscles, in the joints, spreading slowly outward from somewhere in the chest like ice water filling the body from the inside. They gritted their teeth and kept riding. The hotel was close. They just had to get there. But when they finally stumbled through the door of their room, all three of them collapsed onto their beds almost simultaneously. Their foreheads burned. Their limbs felt like stone. They shook with fever chills despite the heavy blankets they pulled over themselves. And then, as they lay there in the dark, each of them became aware of something. They were not alone in the room. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was a feeling. Absolute and cold and certain. Something had followed them back from the cemetery. Something that was now in the room with them, watching from the corners, pressing against the walls, filling the silence with a presence that had no name. Alexei looked toward the mirror on the wall. In its reflection, he could see dark shadows, formless but deliberate, moving around Dmitri and Pavel, coiling around them, pulling at them like hands reaching through fabric. He tried to call out to them, but the room tilted, and the darkness took him. When Dmitri opened his eyes, he was back in the cemetery. The night was absolute. No stars, no moon, just blackness and cold, and the shapes of headstones in every direction. He called out for Pavel and Alexei. No answer. He stumbled between the graves, searching for the gate. but every path led deeper into the cemetery, not out of it. He was trapped. Then his foot struck something in the dark. He looked down. A headstone. He crouched and read the name carved into it. Pavel Sorokin. He staggered to his feet. The grave beside it read, Alexei Morozov. His eyes moved to the third stone. Dmitry Volkov. His own name. His own dates of birth, and a date of death that was today. Something rolled across the frozen ground and bumped against his boot. He looked down. It was Pavel's severed head, eyes open, staring up at him from the frost. Dmitry screamed and spun around, and found Alexei standing behind him. But it wasn't Alexei anymore. His eyes were completely black, two voids where his friend's warm gray eyes had been. His head tilted slowly to one side at an angle no living neck should allow. He reached out and wrapped both hands around Dmitry's throat. He woke up gasping. He was in the hotel room. Alexei was shaking him by the shoulder. Pavel was sitting up in his bed across the room, white-faced and trembling. "You were screaming in your sleep," Alexei said. Dmitry sat up and pressed his hands over his face, trying to slow his breathing. When he finally lowered them, he described what he had seen. Every detail, the grave markers with their names, Pavel's head, Alexei's black eyes. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Then Pavel spoke. "I had the same dream," he said. "Exactly the same." Alexei nodded slowly. "So did I." All three of them looked at each other across the small hotel room as the wind pushed against the window outside. Then they ran. The hotel receptionist was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s named Grigory, a local born and raised in Ovsyanka, who had grown up hearing the stories of the old cemetery the way other children grew up hearing bedtime stories. When Dmitry described what had happened, the cemetery, the fever, the shadows in the mirror, the shared dream, Grigory's expression didn't change. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting this conversation for a long time. He led the three of them back to their room and sat them down. "You disturbed them," he said simply. "The souls buried in that place have been restless since the landslide. They have been there a long time. They do not like to be laughed at." He told them what needed to be done. He arranged the three young men in a circle on the floor. He knelt beside them and instructed them to follow his words exactly. An old Siberian prayer of apology passed down through generations of local families who knew better than to build their lives near that iron gate. "Whatever you see," Grigory told them quietly, "do not stop." He closed his eyes. He began. The three friends repeated his words in trembling voices, and then they saw them. Dark shapes, dozens of them, circling in the air above the circle, drifting like smoke, pressing closer and then pulling back, surrounding them on all sides without touching. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. The candle Grigory had placed in the center of the circle flickered violently, but they kept reciting, word by word, breath by breath. And then, one by one, the shadows dissolved. The temperature rose. The candle steadied. The presence in the room, that cold, watching weight that had followed them back from the cemetery, lifted completely, like a fog burning away in morning light. Grigory opened his eyes. "They have forgiven you," he said. The fever broke within the hour. By morning, all three of them felt as though the previous night had never happened. The pain gone, the exhaustion gone, their bodies completely restored. But the memory remained. Dmitry, who had once laughed at every ghost story he'd ever heard, packed his bag in silence the next morning and said very little on the ride home. He never visited another cemetery for the rest of his life. None of them did. And whenever someone in their group suggested somewhere interesting to explore, somewhere old, somewhere abandoned, somewhere with a history of death, all three of them would look at each other. And quietly, without explanation, they would say no.